Hello everyone, welcome back for our last E-class in this module. This is on social work functions and roles and a little bit on social work and social policy. As always, we'll start with our overview. We're going to go over the learning objectives for this class, go over a reading review, and then we're going to talk about generalist practice and social work roles. So from your reading and by the end of this class, I hope you'll be able to identify the characteristics of the multi-level approach to generalist social work practice, so micro, meso, and macro levels of social work practice. Be able to summarize the consultancy function of social work across all three levels, describe resource management as a function of social work across all three levels, and detail education as a social work function across all of the three levels. And finally, be able to describe the relationship between social work and social policy. So when you finish reading this chapter and finish reviewing this e-course, you should be familiar with these terms. So you should be familiar with the various roles that social workers can take and what these look like at the different levels of practice. So these include the enabler role, facilitator role, planner, broker and advocate, convener and mediator, activists, teachers, trainers, and outreach. So we've talked about generalist practice throughout the class thus far, but it's good to take a moment just to remember really what generalist practice is about and how we as social workers practice from a generalist perspective. So when we talk about generalist social work, again, we're talking about that micro, meso, and macro levels and how we as social workers try to view problems holistically and intervene across all levels. So again, as we talked about way back in the second module, about the river, right, and helping the clients who are coming down from the waterfall, but also then going upstream and looking for the source of problems and how we can intervene there. So again, that's just a reminder, and keep that in mind as we now go into more specific details of the different types of practice that social workers are involved in at each of these levels. So as general social workers, we're really involved in three overlapping functions: consultancy, resource management, and education. And these look a little bit different at each of the three levels, but really they all kind of overlap and they synergize. After all, policy developed at the macro level has influences all the way down to individual clients. And so we have to really understand each of the levels, and we have to take on different roles and different approaches in order to help clients, be they individuals, groups, communities, address the issues that are oppressing them or are making life challenging for them. And as a reminder, remember, we use an empowerment orientation or an empowerment approach when we work with client systems, be they individuals, groups, families, communities, etc. And again, when we use that empowerment orientation, we select strategies that will best meet the client's goals. They have an active stake in helping to create those goals and defining them, as we talked about in the last E-class. And we specifically select strategies that are most appropriate for addressing the nature of the problem. So in order to help contextualize how we work at the different levels as a social worker, we're going to start with a case example. Now this is an individual and her family, but we can also expand on this and extrapolate based on her experiences with breast cancer to think about how we as social workers at the meso level or macro level would work to address issues in terms of funding, research, education around breast cancer. So we've got Naomi, and she's a 42-year-old mother of 3 children who are 10, 7, and 3. Naomi discovered a lump in her breast a couple of weeks ago, and she and her husband David have been anxiously awaiting news regarding test results. When the diagnosis of cancer finally comes, they're both stunned and frightened, but pull themselves together for the sake of the children. Naomi begins the long journey of doctor, surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments, while simultaneously trying to maintain family life and a part-time job as best she can. David takes on new duties as a more active parent and homemaker while still going to his full-time job. He struggles with his own fears and anger about what is happening, initially not sharing these with Naomi because he is determined to be her rock. So now I want you to take a few minutes and just write down some of the issues or stressors that you see happening in this situation. Pause the video, write those down, and when you're ready, we'll talk about them, and then we'll go on to how, as a social worker, we would work with this family and around the topic of breast cancer at the different levels. Okay, so some of the stressors are things that we would be looking at as a social worker when we're thinking about working with this family in particular. Does Naomi have the access to resources, transportation and otherwise, to take care of herself, her children, her husband? Can they all get to the things they need to get? Do they have access to medications, healthy food, things like that? We'd also be wanting to look at the stress that Naomi is experiencing in terms of her health, also trying to maintain her family and take care of them, and keeping a part-time job. That's a great deal for one person to take on, and we may want to look at helping her find, and as well as her husband, find alternative solutions, some respite care, someone who maybe can come in and do low-cost babysitting, things like that. And David, again, we're seeing him step up and take on more roles than he has in the past, which can be a real stressor. And the fact that he's not really talking about his feelings could create tensions within the marriage. So there's all kinds of issues going on just within this family that as a social worker we would work with. And then there are also kind of the bigger picture issues in terms of funding, health access to health care, access to knowledge and education about breast cancer, and things like that. So we'll talk about this whole kind of large topic at each of the different levels as we go through the slides. So we'll begin with a discussion of the micro level and how we'd work with Naomi and her family. First, we would probably work as a consultant or potentially as a therapist. So as we discussed in the last E-class with how we would develop that relationship, what steps we would take in terms of goal planning and things like that, we would do here with Naomi and potentially with her family as well. Right, so we would form a relationship, develop a relationship with Naomi and her family, identify their goals, identify what stressors are happening in their lives, and try to help them work through that. So for Naomi, we may work around her grief and anger around the diagnosis of breast cancer. For the husband, David, we would want to be working around his feelings of anger and frustration. We would want to be talking with him about how he's feeling about taking on more duties at home, and how that's creating stress in his life with his full-time job. So we would want to work with individual members of the family, but also as a collective, because we'd also want to consider the children and how they understand what's happening with their mom, what their fears are, and things like that. And we'd also work with them as a research manager or a broker, right? We would want to, based on the goals that they've developed, based on our sessions, help them access any resources that they need. So we may help them access transportation. We may help them access respite care, particularly with Naomi trying to work full time and take care of the kids and the chemotherapy treatment, and David working full time and trying to do more at home. That's a real stressor. That could really kind of wear them both down. And so if we could intervene with some respite care or potentially, some home delivered meals, some other ways that we could help alleviate the burden a little bit, that could potentially really help both Naomi and David. And then we could also work at a teacher or kind of educator role, right? So we might want to be working with Naomi and her family around the education in terms of a diagnosis of breast cancer, what it means now and long term. We may want to be working to develop client skills around particularly, for example, with David around dealing with the stress in his life. We may also be monitoring throughout this around depression, and we may be educating the family about feelings of depression, when to notice the signs and symptoms, and things like that. And throughout our work with this family, we would be taking on all of these roles. We wouldn't necessarily be doing one and then the other and then the other. We would start where the client is at, helping them identify their goals and accessing those resources, developing those skills that they need, all kind of in a synergistic way in order to help them best meet what challenges they're experiencing. Next, let's talk a little bit about practice at the meso level. And again, we'll draw from Naomi's family and the topic of breast cancer and breast cancer awareness. So at the meso level, social workers are often involved in either developing and running groups, for example, a support group for women who are diagnosed with breast cancer or survivors of breast cancer. We're also often involved in terms of bringing organizations together to create partnerships and things like that. We also tend to be involved in terms of helping to plan, develop, and evaluate group-based interventions. Now, in terms of resource management, we often work as brokers and advocates. So we tend to do this in one of two ways. We may be involved ourselves as part of our agency in terms of advocating for issues that we're seeing at the micro level. So inadequate resources in the community, inadequate programs and services. We may also be involved in coordinating the services with multiple providers. Now, the other way we may do this is in terms of empowering the clients that we work with to become involved in advocacy efforts. So, for example, after Naomi goes into remission, we may have her help her to become involved in raising awareness around breast cancer, educating the community, and things like that. She may also be an advocate if there were resources or services that were missing in the community that could have helped her. We may help her take on an advocacy role in order to raise community awareness about the importance of those services. The final area where we tend to work at the meso level is in terms of education and training. And we tend to take on the role of a trainer. And we may be involved from developing the training, implementing the training, and evaluating the training. So, for example, in the case of Naomi and breast cancer, we may actually be involved in getting service providers, health professionals together to provide public forum information on breast cancer signs and symptoms. We could be involved in developing workshops around loss and grief in terms of cancer and breast cancer survivors. We may also be involved in developing programs for other professions, helping them develop them in terms of education and things like that. So we may actually be involved in developing trainings, implementing trainings, and evaluating trainings. So, for example, my previous work has been in terms of developing training for state assessors, for area agencies on aging in terms of Medicaid eligibility. And my role was to work with stakeholders in the community, those who use services, as well as professionals, to develop the training. We then implemented it and evaluated the training in terms of tests to see how well the assessors then understood the material that we had covered. So again, social workers, again, these meso-level practices, working with groups and things like that, again, they overlap quite a bit in terms of what you would do. A lot of it is around education. A lot of it is in terms of bringing groups together and supporting groups from the beginning, the middle, and all the way to the end. So now let's talk a little bit about macro level practice. We'll start by talking about consultancy and resource management. So at the macro level, we may be involved in assessing the community in terms of the resources that it has, capabilities, and also gaps in services and supports. Again, in the case of Naomi, we'd be looking at, what resources she has access to, what resources she needs, and where the gaps in services are that are making it more difficult for her and her family to function. So again, we think about it, even if we're working at the micro level, we need to consider all the way up to the macro level. If we're working at the macro level, we need to think all the way down in terms of how our work, in terms of policy and things like that, and impacts individual clients. So again, at the planning role, we may be helping to develop policies and initiate programs. Again, most of this is around the needs assessment that we would conduct, the community profile that we would develop to understand where the gaps are. In resource management, we would be trying to bring together key community players. So we'd be working to develop coalitions or at least just open lines of communication between organizations who have an vested interest in this particular topic. So we may be bringing together representatives from hospitals, from pharmacies, we may be doing it in terms of schools and educations, religious organizations, all of these different spheres of our lives that could be impacted by cancer and cancer diagnoses and things like that. We would want to bring them to the table to identify and discuss what resources aren't available in our community, how we could better leverage our combined efforts to lobby for change, either at the local level, the state level, or the national level. And at the macro level, again, we see this as somewhat similar to the meso level. We'd be involved in education and outreach and connecting people together. We might also be involved in helping to facilitate prevention. So the meso level, if we developed a training for screenings around breast cancer, education, at the macro level, we may be involved with hospital and doing widespread implementation of this training. We might also be involved in terms of educating policymakers and decision makers about social issues. We may be reminding them of the consequences of not investing as we should in terms of healthcare and ensuring everyone has access to it, in terms of the funding that we put into research for cancer and things like that. So again, whether you're working specifically for like a macro-oriented organization, one that focuses more on micro work or practice with individuals, we have to consider all of the different levels of practice as we do our work, because they all impact each other, they all influence each other. What we do upstream in terms of developing policies directly impacts the lives of clients, and vice versa. We can take the issues that we're seeing with clients, and we can do a case to cause model for advocacy. We can identify issues that they're experiencing and build advocacy efforts at the local level, the state level, and the national level to help resolve these social justice issues. As we finish up, I'd like you just to take a few minutes to think about what levels of practice you're interested in and what roles and activities at those levels particularly interest you. If you're interested in working with individuals, are you interested in therapy? Are you interested in more kind of case management and resource brokering? The meso level, are you interested in running groups and facilitating support groups or developing trainings? At the macro level, are you interested in helping develop coalitions, doing some community organizing, or are you more interested in getting involved in lobbying efforts or developing policy? We're going to take a few minutes to think about this and reflect on this in your journal. So now as we finish up, just a reminder on what you've got coming up. You've got Journal 2 coming up in the next week, as well as Quiz 1 and Milestone Check-in 2. Now you'll see on Canvas that I have moved back the due date for Journal 2, as I haven't had a chance to grade your Journal 1s as fast as I would have liked to. I want to give you a bit more time to finish those up. If you have it done and completed in the normal time frame, that's totally fine. Turn it in. But you've also now got a few more days to finish up Journal 2. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, send me an email, because odds are you're not the only one, and I will address it either for you or for the class, depending on what the concern or issue is. All right, everyone, have a great week, and I will see you next week.